to introduce Lynch. He wants to talk to us about the lessons learned from a large multinational organization. So please welcome him and looking up for a very interesting practical presentation. Thank you.
So, good afternoon, everybody. I'm really happy I'm not the first slot after lunch, so you're all now awake, which is great. So, as you just heard there, I'll talk to you about global, group level, multinational, corporate scale transformational change this afternoon. And I'll qualify the experiences I'll share with you because I was responsible for the transformation of the Shell lubricant supply chain. So if you had the pleasure of hearing me last year, I presented last year the full story up to the point of last year at least. The story is now a year further on of the Shell lubricants. I'll touch on a few slides to remind you of what that transformation was, so that if you're in a business which is a large multinational supply chain and you want to make comparisons of the size and complexity to check relevance of what I'll describe, then you can do so. And if you're selling software or selling services to help businesses transform, then again you can calibrate what was the transformation at Shell. But beyond the transformation at Shell itself, I want to draw on some particular things that go into how did it happen, why did it happen, what were the challenges of making it happen in a very large company. So, is this the clicker for?
Oh yes.
So let's have a.
Should work.
I'll go.
Sorry, let me.
I'll go old school.
Yeah, let me see.
So,
Someone else switch it off.
okay, thank you. So a little bit about the Shell lubricants business. In itself, it's a little bit like a consumer packaged goods business. So if you're in a supply chain or you're familiar with supply chains that put products into bottles, products into jars, pots, drums and so on, then you'll see machinery like this putting liquid into those types of things. So if you're in food, hair care, laundry, any of those CPG. But it's also into motor manufacturing, engineering, providing first fill. So this is not, we don't supply, or Shell doesn't supply Daimler with all the oil they need for new cars in 1 litre pots. We send it in trucks, in big 22,000 litre trucks. It makes much more sense. It's very big, it's a global supply chain, traditional, like many global multinational companies, it has operations in all of the commercial industrial centres that you would recognise in most of the developed countries around the world. It's a big supply chain, so 5 billion litres a year of product. I always use that figure, I used it last year, and I'm still surprised by that number, because it's a really big number. But start to think that behind a really big number like 5 billion litres a year lies a lot of complexity in 5 billion litres. 30 million deliveries, 2 million bottles a day, lots and lots of product. It's about 30 or so internally run and managed manufacturing plants with a bunch of third-party finished goods suppliers, up to 200 warehouse and distribution centre locations globally. On a single instance of SAP, using all of the traditional tools that you would find in an SAP environment, so all the APO, SNP, PPDS, forecasting, and so on, all of those things. Lots of progress had been made. There's a lot of inventory in that supply chain. Lots of progress had been made in the last decade, but there was a point in time where the progress through the traditional tools was just not enough. And I'll talk about sort of the transition into the decision to going with demand-driven. So what was the scope of the deployment itself? So just looking at a little bit about the actual transformation. Start with the finished goods. I mentioned there was a whole series of regional distribution centres, country-level distribution centres, national centres, DCs in states. So if you look at North America, there are DCs all around there. In Europe, they were country level, and across Asia, there were a mixture of DCs in different parts of territories. China, many DCs, places like Singapore, one DC. So you'd see a mixture of finished goods network replenishment there. All of the finished goods replenishment, the calculations as to what to purchase from a third party or what to send as a signal to a manufacturing plant to make, or what to move between depots, the trigger between the DC and the RDC, for example, all of that is in scope to be managed by the demand-driven methodology. Plants and warehouses. Some plants have warehouses attached to the plants, so there was some degree of distribution from the manufacturing facility to a DC or to another warehouse, and in some countries, direct sale to customer would go from the plant if the customer was local to the plant, or it would go. So there's a degree of complexity around that kind of stuff. In the Shell supply chain, with those big numbers of 5 billion litres, lots and lots of product, just over half of the volume sold goes through the indirect channel, goes through distributors. And that's either a series of distributors within a country, or a distributor who is operating at the country level, where Shell had maybe pulled out its own domestic sales entity and using a distributor to operate at the entire country level. So more than half of the business is in the indirect channel. For those of you who have experience of the indirect channel, it's really quite challenging, because the skills and competencies and supply chain processes in a distributor who is good at selling, they tend to not be quite so good at the supply chain stuff, like the ordering processes, the forecasting processes, inventory management strategy and stuff like that. So just imagine, in that big supply chain, half of it is riddled with the noise and firefighting that goes on in indirect. And then, of course, it wasn't just the finished goods, it was the bill of material, inbound components, raw materials, supplies, caps, carton, bottles, all of the bits and bobs you need to make the products, but also the fundamental product materials themselves, the base oil, which is the blank generic oil, but also the additives, which are like if you think of Coke is water and syrup, the additive is effectively like the syrup you put into the Coca-Cola, and the fizzy water is like the base oil. So it's a mixing and blending operation. So all of these things were buffered as well in scope. So these things it was effectively all of the planning. So all of it. I did not want to leave any planning left in the legacy APO system. Now, there's lots of reasons that you could argue to do that, simplicity, simplify your IT structure and interfaces and so on. I just didn't want the planning population to have to live in two systems. It was fundamentally important that if we're going to make the change, I want everybody to make the change in the system that we chose. And the other thing here, the regional planning centre that I mentioned, in 2015, which was the starting point of the transition to demand-driven, where I introduced the concept and started the change management with the discussions, the selling and so on, and I'll touch a little bit on that a little bit later. We'd already taken out, at the beginning of 2015, a significant amount of headcount as an operational initiative to reduce headcount in the company. Very common in many multinationals, I'm sure many of you will recognise that. And we created a service centre in Poland covering the European region. And at the same time, we started transitioning to demand-driven. So not only did we implement in the factories, where planning was happening in the factories, and across the network planning locations, but we also covered the service centre who were doing all inbound scheduling for Europe. And that's done in Krakow in Poland. So a degree of complexity there around the scope. So, big supply chain, we're going for it all. But how on earth do you start and how do you manage a supply chain transition, a transformation in that way, in a supply chain of this size? It all starts really with what are the problems, what are the pressures? And if you are in a global corporation, global company, big supply chain company, you will know this anyway. But as I speak to companies in the role that I'm in now with SmartChain, these are all the things I experienced in Shell, but these are things that time after time when we speak to different companies and say, you know, how are you getting on with working capital, you know, the pressure on inventory, how are you getting on with cost, you know, how are you managing capacity, is there pressure on your capacity, you know, network rationalizations, removing of plants across the network to rationalise networks, rationalise supply, cash flow, is your CFO, you know, putting pressure on all of the operation to liberate cash flow in the company. These are all very, very real things. The background of all of this is that these are pressures affecting all functions across the supply chain, not just the folks in planning, but the folks in logistics feel it, the folks in production feel it, procurement feel it, everybody's feeling it. But in the global companies, there's a couple of things you would say about those typically, and these were absolutely the case in the business that I was in. Functionally very silo organised. There's a logistics silo, there's an operational manufacturing silo, there's a planning silo, there's a procurement silo. There are other different silos in there. And whilst they may all sit within an umbrella of supply chain, or sometimes they sit in supply chain with another umbrella of operations, the chances are in the organisation that there is a degree of tension between those silos. Where the silos are given different objectives, different goals to reach. So operations might have a cost-related goal, so getting unit cost or throughput or plant utilisation up, whilst planning are trying to get inventories down. So you find in a global multinational company that there are some conflicts within there that are a result of the different functional silos that you have in the organisation. The other thing that I'd say about the general environment of a global multinational setup is that we play whack-a-mole. Does everybody know what whack-a-mole is when I say that? It's the kind of game, the fairground game, where you have a big hammer, something pops up, you hit it, then another thing pops up, you've got to hit that one, and then you hit that one. Over the last 10 years, I can probably describe 4 or 5 different phases where a different mole popped up. One year the mole might be customer service. So you've had a bit of a crisis, something's happened, some big customers, some big influential customers are phoning the EVP, the CEO, whoever it might be, and that phone call trickles down the organisation. And for that period of time, and it could be 3 months, 6 months, a year, customer service is your absolute number one priority, because the guy that received the phone call doesn't want to receive another one of those phone calls, so we chase that mole. But then a year later or 6 months later, at the end of the year, the numbers are run, the P&L is run, and now the finance officer is jumping up and down because have you seen the inventory? Have you seen what's happened to the inventory? The operational guys are under enormous pressure because they've had to go and rent some more warehouses for the inventory, so the OPEX is up. And so we start chasing those things. And so the following year, we're chasing those moles and we let the service level slide because all of the time we're making compromises. You know, we're making choices as to which mole we want to hit at a given time. So in these environments, it's not even that everybody's chasing the same mole at the same time. In North America, you might be chasing service level. In Asia, you might be chasing inventory. In Europe, you might be chasing something else. So again, it's a complex picture when you're looking at a complex environment there. But there's one thing that is no doubt that everybody's under a significant amount of pressure in the supply chain.